Yeah, so I mean, the deadlift specifically hits home with me because I mean, in overcoming a barrier of entry or objection, and overcoming objection with someone to deadlift, as a chiropractor by trade, what does everyone say? Oh, deadlifts are bad for your back. It's like, well, I know a little bit about the back. And then as I was strength and conditioning coach at Stanford University with the rugby team for multiple years. So in a sport, that specific sport in general, that actually has a lot of carryover. If you think about the positions you find yourself in a rugby match, that deep hinge position, unlike most other sports, you're going to see a great amount of carryover. So people were putting words in his mouth. Like, I don't think to give the, to play devil's advocate to like the narrative that spun as it sort of landed on my doorstep. Like, I don't think he's necessarily saying anything bad about the deadlift per se. He's saying that a lot of people might not see a carryover. Like, let's say like we're looking at life as a sport, and as coaches, we are strength and conditioning coaches for life as a sport. Does it have much carryover? Yeah, I think so. Have I seen drastic amounts of injury around it? Yes. But I think there's a way to pre-screen if we know like what we're looking for. Like, look, my dog doesn't know the internet exists, right? Like, he doesn't have the instruments to perceive that as a thing. Now, unless you have an extensive strength and conditioning background and a very deep understanding of the muscular physiology around muscles of the spine and surrounding the spine, you might not have the instruments to see when and where this is bad. Like, if you can't do a body weight pull up in a neutral grip where you're really going to use your lats to stabilize your spine and move your body, you likely shouldn't be loading a barbell from the floor, because those same lats that are going to move your own body are now going to be loaded on a medium that gives you a much longer runway of progression of load past your body weight. Right. So if we're trying to load on a bar extra physiologically more than we can control and within our own body weight, then yeah, that's gonna leave force transfer going through discs in the spine and vertebra in your back. That could be potentially dangerous. But there's ways to pre-screen for it that, again, if you don't have these instruments, it might seem like this abstract concept. So I just think, consider your sources, right? Like, if you're getting your training advice from a podcast with, Robert obviously has like a lot of experience. I don't know to what degree Rogan has experience. I feel like every time I come on here, it's just like, so Rogan said this thing, go. It's like, just pull the pin out of the grenade. Yeah, I mean, to be a little bit more diplomatic, like, they're not wrong. Like, as a chiropractor, I've seen a lot of injuries that as a consequence of deadlifting. But I think how many times in the run of a day, I would say deadlifting is more functional than squatting, and I would say all power lifts are more of an expression of function rather than functional movement. So
if I could summarize this in a very, very short phrase,
because he just said it in Latin,
right? No, that's okay. No, and I know I want it. Here's why I want to summarize it, because this is how we've explained it in the past. If you can do a lift with good stability, good control, and good strength. In other words, if that lift is appropriate for your body, that is a safe lift. If you do it right, it's a safe lift. Does that summarize it effectively?
I like the lot. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot more to it. Like, how do we assess stability? How do we assess range of motion? How do we assess, the implications of function? But yeah, absolutely.
I also, the argument that I make too is that, let's say you don't have the prerequisites yet, the pursuit of that, in my opinion, is the most valuable. Paramount. Like, and that's why I don't like statements like, "Oh, you shouldn't do this," or trying to get people to avoid movements like this.
Figure out why.
Like, yeah, if you can't do it, okay, maybe that means at this moment you you shouldn't be loading a bar and doing it right now. But that should be a major red flag in your life that I need to figure out how the fuck to do that. And I'm, aside from all my other fitness goals that I think are important, they're all going to take a sidebar, and I'm going to put a lot of energy and effort towards getting to where I could do this movement. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, and I think that's where these lifts, like, I will go on record and say that squatting isn't functional. It's not. Like, and I was like, oh, like, do you sit on the toilet? It's like, yeah, I could probably pistol to a fucking toilet too. You know what I mean? Like, if you take, like, to me, gait cycle movements are functional. That's what defines us as humans. Like, if you want to talk about muscle function, function is how muscles behave when we walk and breathe. Fight me, change my mind. Right? There's a clear distinction between these two things. It's like, oh, like, we sit down and take a look. If you have a day that goes by where you take more shits than you take steps, your days on this earth are numbered, right? Because that's human function, it's gait cycle. So it's like, deadlifting is not that, but it is an expression of function. Right. So like you said, like, I mean, I was a strength and conditioning coach at Stanford. I dealt with 17, 18-year-old kids who were incredibly athletic, but some very incredibly uncoordinated. Like, they had a great acumen for their sport, but lifting was not their sport. right? Am I going to try and snatch and clean and jerk these kids? No. If I could, then that would be a great expression of their function. But that's not really, I'm after driving intent of like explosive power output and things like that. So for me, rather than an Olympic lift, it's like, hey, let's just do a box jump. I think we could do that. That's explosive enough to drive the intent. But in the back of my mind, it's like, why can't these people do an Olympic lift? Well, they have no overhead mobility. Okay, hey, then in the background of just like, okay, we're going to box jump rather than snatch or clean and jerk. On the background is like, hey, we need to improve your thoracic extension. We need to limit your bias towards internal rotation. We need to strengthen, stabilize the posterior shoulder. In the few years I had working with them, I knew that they weren't going to get to the point where they're going to be progressed from box jump to snatch or clean and jerk. But that was our trajectory. That's the end goal. Like that is the end of the runway, right? So yeah, like you said, like avoiding provocation isn't treatment. Right. Like, oh, deadlift hurts or deadlift might be bad. It's like, okay, we'll bolster it, reinforce, assess, and understand why and work towards that not being a thing.
In my experience, one of the best things I ever did with clients, and this took me a while to piece together, was, okay, you can't do a squat, you can't do a deadlift, you can't do an overhead press properly. Let's figure out why, let's work towards that. Sometimes I never got to that place. Sometimes I would have a client, advanced age, and we never got to the point where we could load a squat, or I never got to the point where I could do a barbell deadlift or a full standing overhead press. But the progress was incredible when I tried to get them to the point to be able to do those things. And sometimes I did get them to do those things. And then when they were able to do those things, they progressed through the roof. And it was far better than the first half of my career where I would say, oh, you can't squat? Okay, we're going to avoid that. Who cares? Here's a machine. Here's a machine. Here's a machine. That's all we're going to focus on. When I moved away from that, tried to figure out, okay, well, why can't you just do a normal standing squat? Why can't you lift something off the ground without it hurting or without you being stable? Why can't you just push something up above your head? Let's figure that out. And then when I did, man, the results, and I'm talking about average every day. I didn't train athletes. Very rarely did I train athletes like you did. I wasn't training bodybuilders. I was training, Mrs. Smith, who's a soccer mom, or, John, who's a business guy, hasn't worked out since he was in college. They got phenomenal results from doing that. I'm talking about working them out 2 or 3 days a week. At the most.
Yeah, and I also think, too, like with a statement like Robert Oberst made on the show, like it's in front of like millions of people. And so this is something where it does resonate to us because, given the risk versus reward, there's always that risk versus reward. And who does it really apply to based off of like, their prerequisites? How good is their body stabilizing? Like, there's all these factors to that. But what it does for the most part is deter people from them pursuing something like the deadlift, which I think is, something that we need to sort of like nip at the bud.
Here, it's same people who are like, don't deadlift and squat. They're bad for you, but you should go running. Like what? Yeah. Running is extremely complex. Yeah, humans evolved to run, but none of us have done it ever since we were kids. We don't run very well, so you're going to go encourage people to go running, which has a very, very high injury rate. I think the conversation around resistance training, especially heavy resistance training, needs to be appropriate and accurate.